Thank you all very much for coming back and reconvening. If you could all find your seats, we'll get started on this final session. The purpose of this session is to provide an opportunity for those who have not spoken and for those who already have offered perspectives of one kind and another, as a speaker, as a commenter, as a questioner, to add a further reflection, a point where you feel it's important to emphasize, a point where you feel there has been common ground expressed, a point where you feel we have either neglected it completely or haven't put sufficient emphasis on that point. Please keep in mind that our aim is to help inform and to encourage the process which we described at the outset, which is underway now with the lead of the NSABB and with input from many quarters here in the U.S. And we're all very mindful of the importance also of collaborating and coordinating across national boundaries. So that will be a further important element. For those of you who are on the webcast, and indeed for everyone, we would invite you, in addition, to provide any further comment, if you wish, by email or other communication. It would be most helpful to us if we receive it within the next week so that it can be factored into the summary of this discussion. We're here to provide ultimately a set of reflections and ideas that will be compiled by our staff in an official summary of the deliberation discussions at this meeting, and that in turn will provide an ongoing foundation to be used in the process of further discussions and decision-making about gain-of-function research. So at this point, I'd like to open the floor here to any who would like to offer a comment. Again, if you would, please identify yourself, and then we'll look forward to your further reflection.
Thank you. Laurie Garrett from the Council on Foreign Relations. There's just a couple. First of all, I want to say I thought the rapporteur summaries were extraordinary. I thought they did a fantastic job, and congratulations to all of them. There were a few things I would say were missing and need to be probably emphasized. First of all, we heard two examples where it was stated that there was a risk to public health from not doing GOF. So when we talked risk, we didn't talk risk of the absence of the research. The two were Phil talking about GOF-related restrictions on vaccine research in the private sector, and Ralph saying that there were components of MERS research that were absolutely at a standstill because of GOF restrictions. The second thing is, I think the whole question of how all of this fits in the international picture is hard to talk about in the context of your limitation being advisory to NSABB and NIH. But I don't think it can be ignored. In every single case of foreign policy and international implications of how different cultures around the world are viewing this research, often without having any idea that it's called gain of function or it has anything to do with H5N1, but just general suspicion of certain types of research carried out by people in Europe and the United States and Canada. Our ultimate fallback position on everything is the World Health Organization. It is the only body that has the capacity to bring all players together in a format that is neutral and allows for open venting of the various perspectives of all cultures. And I think we have to frankly admit that at this time, WHO is a tremendously weak institution. It's just barely gasping for air. And the Ebola epidemic has deeply undermined the credibility of the institution. And that leads to the possibility that a major part of any governance side of this question has to be increased U.S. government attention to trying to bolster and reform WHO, get it back off of life support and into being a functioning, governing institution for global health.
Lori, thank you for your comments. Before I turn to our next speakers, I would like to just take a moment to recognize and invite the President of the National Academy of Sciences, Ralph Cicerone, who's able to join us briefly this morning, if he would like to offer his reflections and thoughts about the role and significance of this gathering, and any other words of encouragement, Ralph, that you would care to provide, we would be very grateful. So thank you so much for coming down, and look forward to your comments as well.
Well, as Dr. Feinberg said, I've been huddling in various places in this room, largely out of enthusiasm and appreciation for what you're doing. I know that Dr. Zhao welcomed you formally yesterday. I just want to add my welcome to all of you and thank you for participating, because we occasionally try to hold symposia like this on complex and important topics that are underpinned by science in some way. So we're really glad. We also thank the people who've sponsored this work. The National Institutes of Health is very appreciative also that you would come here, because they're depending, at least one of the purposes of this meeting is to give them some input as they try to formulate guidelines and policies that will allow the science to proceed on the one hand, largely in the expectation that that future research will result in more effective ways of preventing and containing viral pandemics. But also the other reason, though, is to get people together, because there are differences of opinions and different viewpoints on how to confront this entire universe of issues. So the quality of the discussions and the presentations, I think, has been great, and I think the input from this meeting, not only to NIH, but to the rest of you and your thinking, is turning out to be valuable. The organizing committee for the symposium on the risks and benefits of gain-of-function research, Dr. Feinberg and the others, we really appreciate it, because the landscape has been changing, the stakes are high. It's the middle of December when people usually don't travel, so thank you again for being here, and I look forward to reading through a transcript of the summaries, although I've already heard quite a few of them and have gained a lot. So Harvey, thank you very much, and carry on.
Thank you so much, Ralph. Greatly appreciate you being with us.
I just wanted to follow up on something I think Chuck said.
Could you identify yourself, Garrett?
This is Gavin Huntley-Fenner, and wanted to follow up on something that Chuck said about the absence of data. And I think when you're looking at rare occurrences, accidents, fatalities, injuries, and you don't see them, I mean, that's a sign that things are going well, but it's not necessarily a sign that you've got the right data. And so I wanted to just sort of put out a word of caution that if we don't see the data that is relevant to safety, maybe it's a matter of perspective. Think back to at least my days as an early graduate student, going to my advisor and saying, the experiment's not working. And they would sort of take a look, let me see the data. Oh, wait, there's all kinds of interesting things here. Maybe you've got the wrong control, or maybe you should try different analysis. And I think in our case, if you have a safety-minded perspective, you start to see all kinds of interesting things that you can use to build improvements into a process. So I just wanted to put that word out.
Thank you very much, Gavin. I'm reminded of the story about Thomas Edison when he was confronted by a reporter who said he's just failed 99 times to develop this new device. And he said, no, I've succeeded 99 times in showing what will not work.
Thank you. Jim Welch with the Elizabeth R. Griffin Foundation. Just a comment about the process. I want to give thanks to Barbara Johnson and Rebecca Moritz for their outstanding presence as biosafety professionals. And one of the things that I note lacking in the panel part of this is current regional leaders in the biosafety profession. I would strongly encourage, as the process moves forward, that the leadership of the American and European Biosafety Associations be included as a panel part of this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yes, sir.
Tom Inglesby from the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Just a few observations from the rapporteurs and the earlier discussion. Just in terms of the benefits discussion by Ron, I do think Ron presented all the benefits that were aired in the last day and a half, but I just want to make sure that we didn't take that as a consensus view of what the benefits are, because I think there's a view, a widely varying view in the room about the strength of some of those benefits. So just as a point of clarification. The second is that just in terms of the gain of function terminology, I think probably most of us agree that that term is too broad for what we're trying to talk about. And just for the historical record, I would say that I believe that NIH is the first place that used that term for this description of research back in December 2012 when it convened a meeting on this topic. I think, Harvey, you may have been the chair of that meeting. And that term was used to replace what was being used by those who were concerned in the community, who were just using a descriptive sentence that said, we are concerned about the creation of research, novel research-generated strains of highly transmissible, highly pathogenic respiratory viruses, influenza at the time. So that's the provenance of that term. I think it could be retired probably at some point if we could get more descriptive. And the third point, my last point here, is that I do think also, especially after what Ron said just a minute ago, I do think that maybe one thing that we do agree upon in this room, or many people do agree, is that we have a shared concern about the creation of respiratory viruses that are highly pathogenic and highly transmissible. And if that is true, I think that that's a major area of consensus for this meeting, and that would be quite a success. I'm not sure if it's true, but it seemed like there were a number of people from different parts of the community speaking in favor of that sentiment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Koos van der Brugge, Royal Academy of Arts and Sciences in the Netherlands. I repeat my observation of yesterday. There is a shift in the debate from biosecurity to biosafety. Does this mean that if biosafety issues are solved, which is enough difficult, the biosecurity issues are solved also? I don't think so. I'm convinced that the biosecurity risk is very small, but it exists. Last week in the Hanover conference, a presentation was given where biosafety and biosecurity were presented as two overlapping circles. I think there's, for instance, laboratory biosecurity, which certainly overlaps with biosafety. However, there are possible biosecurity threats that ask for separate attention, and often other experts are needed to give advice on these issues. That makes regulating and decision-making more complicated, I realize. And maybe, certainly, there are no easy solutions. But I think it's essential that explicit biosecurity considerations are involved in the deliberations of NSABB, the Advisory Board on Biosecurity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please.
Good morning. I'm Jerry Epstein, Department of Homeland Security. I just wanted to add one additional observation having to do with the different ways the different communities will look at this problem. We see this as clearly a multi-sectoral approach. The scientific community is involved, the security community is involved. And in looking at different perspectives on risk analysis and risk mitigation, I think one difference in the way these communities perceive that ought to be highlighted, and that may be the difference between what's seen as tangible and what's seen as speculative or hypothetical. I think, and I will be exaggerating here, but maybe this is a caricature, but the scientific community, I think, understands the benefits of basic fundamental research. These seem real. The risks of bioterrorism are kind of speculative. We don't really know what. I think the security community comes at this precisely the other way around. Many people in the security community see the risk of terrorism every day, not necessarily bioterrorism, but clearly human intent to do harm is very tangible and very real. There, the benefits of fundamental research are seen as sort of, yeah, they're out there, but they may be seen as speculative. So recognizing the multi-sectoral discussion, I think it's important to notice what's different people see tangibility and hypotheticality differently.
Thank you for that. Please.
Here's Melit, Biosecure Limited. I was struck yesterday in the biosecurity panel with the eloquent discussion over bioterrorism, but I think as you move forward that there's also will be a need to look at the history of state-based activities. And in my personal opinion, if something as sophisticated as gain-of-function research was going to be misused for malign purposes, it's more likely to come from states than from non-state actors. And just to bolt onto that, as we've heard that the WHO has an important convening power, equally there are other institutions at the international level. I would look particularly to the Biological Weapons Convention, and also, although not directly applicable to the US, to many of your research partners, the Nagoya Protocol under the Convention on Biological Diversity as well.
Thank you very much. Please.
Hi, Adolfo García Sastre, virologist. I would like to stress the point that we have gone already through a pause, at least in the influenza community, that was at this time voluntarily, that we realized that there was something important because of the concerns. So we realized that actually there are concerns about doing a specific type of experiments that may result in public health threats. And that as a result of this pause, there has been already implemented a specific regulation to deal with some of these experiments. It is what is called the dual-use research of concern framework. Perhaps the type of agents that are included there may not be perfect, and they should be reevaluated continuously according to scientific evidence, as well as reevaluating whether this process is working or not according to scientific evidence and how it could be implemented. But I want to stress that there is already a process that has been, after a lot of deliberation, being established to deal with part of the experiments that we are talking here, and perhaps with the experiments that we are talking here, these are being put into this type of framework, and this, and that all these deliberations and all of these things that have been done before should be also being taken into place in order to figure out how to move forward. So we are not starting from zero; we are starting already from a lot of discussion and a lot of regulatory processes that has been already implemented. So if, for example, one of the questions I hear is, if I want to make a highly transmissible influenza virus that is highly pathogenic, because I think it's an important scientific question, would I do it? And I think that this is not the actual question, is would I be allowed to do it under what circumstances? And right now, for doing that with flu, I need to write a protocol, why I want to do it, how I want to do it, what are the risks that there are, what are the benefits that I think there are. I need to put this protocol towards the NIH that is going to a federal oversight, and it can be stopped at this moment and then come back. You are not allowed to do this experiment. So there is already regulatory processes that are put in together in order to deal with some of the issues that we are discussing.
Very good. Thank you. Please.
I'm Wayne Hobson, Pasteur Institute. We've heard about the burden of proof. I think in the scientific method, the burden of proof lies with the proposer. And of course, science is a long process. It requires publication of many papers. And as soon as a paper comes out, colleagues take part in hypothesis breaking. And if they can't break the hypothesis grows up. But I think the scientific method and the process is the proposer has to take part in hypothesis breaking. The burden of proof is with the proposer. And we all take part in trying to make this small idea become big, but it shouldn't be the other way around. I think that's not scientific method as we know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nicholas Evans, University of Pennsylvania. I have a couple of conceptual and pragmatic issues to raise before the committee. The first is that any deliberative process going forward needs to recognize the possibility of incommensurate values between practitioners regarding the balance of public health value and the value of innovation, and to echo some of my colleagues in biosecurity, the value of security. All three have to be weighed against each other, and we may find fundamental disagreements about all of those. Second, and I feel that this wasn't adequately discussed over the course of the proceedings, the distinction between the restriction on gain-of-function studies that are proposed or the funding of other research that poses more benefits or different benefits to society needs to be made. Those are two different types of regulatory effects, and I don't think that the same considerations apply in each. This dovetails into a larger issue, which is the importance of institutional memory as we go forward. This is not a new issue. A little while ago, this was referred to as the issue of dual use, and in fact, dual use was an issue when Yoshi and Ron's papers first came to light and the NSABB first deliberated on whether or not to publish that. The issue of dual use has dropped off the agenda to a certain extent, and we've already made a lot of discussion and a lot of progress regarding this issue, and that needs to be remembered. That dovetails into my final point, which is that the types, the quality, and the implications of the data we use need to be considered at every step along the process. In particular, biosafety data is currently, in this country and in many other countries, not well collected. The GAO made this point clear in 2009 when they noted that the number of high containment laboratories are not known in this country. And although we do have numbers for select agent using laboratories, we don't have overall numbers because there's no central collection point, much less for any other type of biosafety data. As we move into using, and I hope we move into using more social sciences data in approaching this issue, we also need to consider the types, the validity and implications of those. If we're going to consider new parts of the scope of this investigation, such as the effects it would have on the graduate pipeline, we need to conduct very careful assessments that are robust, impartial, and have high analytic capacities when it comes to what could happen to graduate students. Straw polls are just not enough. Those are my comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Please.
Peter Hale, Foundation for Vaccine Research. Thank you, Harvey. I do have a question of one of the speakers, but could I just start with 3 comments? First of all, we do need to modify the mantra that this research is going to help us develop better vaccines and antivirals. Bob Lamb was the first person to say that on stage, and we fully endorse that sentiment. It's an argument that's trotted out again and again with very little to substantiate it. It's wishful thinking. Our position is well known. From the beginning of this, going back 3 years ago, we questioned whether this research had any benefit for the development of better vaccines. And our group, as you know, includes some very senior vaccinologists. There's not a single one of them among our group who feels this research has any benefit. It may have some benefit for basic research and knowledge, but in terms of development of better vaccines, has little or no benefit. And if there is any benefit, it's tiny, 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 and way down the road, and in the meantime, it's not worth the risk. There are other priorities. My second comment is that I think we need to separate out the coronaviruses. I think it's confusing, it's muddying the waters and confusing the issue. I don't detect any enthusiasm among the investigators working with SARS and MERS viruses to increase the transmissibility of those viruses. If this pause is affecting their ability to develop animal models, let's take it out, because really this debate, which is where it all started, has to do with high-path avian influenza viruses and what to do about it. I think there would be a consensus in this room that we can treat SARS and MERS viruses differently. My third comment is the question that I wanted to ask Baruch. I admired his slides. I thought they were the most beautiful that were shown today. But my question for him, as an expert in risk-benefit analysis, has to do with the timetable that the process that we're embarked upon has allowed for a comprehensive, independent risk-benefit analysis to be performed. When we took a look at this 18 months ago and consulted with different companies who are expert in this field in catastrophic risk assessment, we talked with a group in London that consults for the largest insurance companies in the world, a think tank in Santa Monica, California. You can probably guess who I'm talking about. But they all said, they told us that if you want an independent, comprehensive, a rigorous, comprehensive risk-benefit assessment that's going to quantify the risks and, to the extent possible, quantify the benefits, then you're talking about a 2-year project. And it's going to cost between $2 and $2.5 million. Even the liability risk component of that analysis, Rand Corporation estimated that that would cost $500,000 and take 6 months. The recommendation was we can't do it all at once. We would need to start with a pilot study that would assess the liability risk of maybe just 4 institutions. And then, based on what we learned from that exercise, it would take us another 6 months to develop a rounded proposal that would assess the overall financial risk not just to the markets and the socioeconomic impacts, but the liability risks in particular. So the timetable we have laid out by the White House seems totally unrealistic, and I'm sorry to state it so bluntly. What can we do about it? Isn't it better to recognize that the timetable doesn't allow for the kind of work that needs to be done?
Thank you for both the comments and the question. I'll let Dr. Fischoff reflect for a moment if he wishes to offer his comments in response, or otherwise we would welcome them. But in the meantime, let me come over to the other side.
Thank you. Mark Lipsitch from Harvard School of Public Health. I was going to say something, I think, very similar to what Adolfo said earlier, although I think we see this topic a bit differently. I think the facts that he highlighted are very important. There are frameworks, prior to the funding pause, there were frameworks in place, not for all influenza or even all highly pathogenic flu, but for H5 and H7 high-path strains, or high-path H5 and H7N9 strains, which said there should be a risk-benefit assessment, that funding should only proceed after such an assessment was passed. So in some sense, it's linguistically hard to understand what the pause means, given the previous actions of the government that seemed to be saying they were doing the same thing. And I think the answer to that question should help us inform thinking about how to go forward with this, and indeed a more, I think the key difference is the level of care and detail. So when the risk-benefit assessments were done, from my understanding of the few proposals that came in between the time that those frameworks were promulgated and the funding pause, they were done without a single quantitative aspect, and they were done on a very sort of short-term basis of a day or something of deliberation. The IBC minutes that were publicized through a FOIA request from, I believe it was Nature, from the Wisconsin IBC, contained only, the only numbers in the risk assessment that was described there were page numbers. So the aspect that's got to be different, I believe, at this point, is a degree of quantitative rigor and a degree of scale of consideration. And very importantly, and this gets back to the sort of fact that there has been a moratorium already, an involvement of a much broader group of people. I think those of us who are critical of the way this process has unfolded, or was unfolding, were particularly critical of the fact that the moratorium was declared by the principal investigators and their very closest colleagues, and lifted by the principal investigators involved and their very closest colleagues. And given the public health aspects of this, a much broader representation of disciplines and of interests is required.
Thank you. Please.
So although I got to say much of my piece yesterday, I was kind of inspired to come up and say something by the comment that essentially no one involved in vaccine production thinks there's any benefit to gain of function. I've actually spoken to a lot of those sorts of folks, I guess being one of them myself. And actually, the community of people who make vaccines is divided, I'd say, just as much of this audience is divided. And I think the basis for that division is somewhat informative. You know, flu vaccines today are still made by very, very old techniques. I mean, you basically look at what's spreading out there, you see if it has changed in hemagglutination inhibition tests with Faradandisera, and you pick your strain. That's the way most of the work is done, and you put your stuff in chicken eggs. And from that perspective, if that's just the way we're going to do things, yeah, there's not a lot of basic science to it anymore. It's really 1960s science, and new science is irrelevant. However, we also have seen that certainly in 2009, we weren't fast enough, and many people have commented that our current flu vaccines, although they do a lot of good, are not good enough. And there's also a lot of people who work on vaccines who think we need to do things better. And one of the ways we need to do things better is taking much more advantage of the information that's out there, particularly sequence-based information, so we can do things, in this case, faster. Related, but a separate topic, is how can we make vaccines better, but in this case it's about faster. And the information from the gain of function can contribute to identifying risks earlier before you've had a chance to really see how something spreads in the community, so that when you first get that isolate, or not you get it, when anyone gets it who can sequence, and that's a growing community of people, a risk assessment on that isolate can be done and measures can be taken earlier. So I don't think it's the case either that gain-of-function research is essential to the current vaccine system as it is practiced generally today, because the way it's practiced today is really 1960s science still. Although we saw with H7N9 the start of new things, and Stacy Schultz-Cherry really described how even the conventional system is increasingly taking into account more and more information. But it's also not useless. It's clearly part of the trend of trying to understand the virus better, trying to predict what it's going to do better, and respond more quickly, and we clearly need to respond more quickly. So that doesn't mean it's open season to do whatever you want and forget the risks. It's still, a balance has to be drawn, and you can debate about whether that line should be drawn. But I don't think it's the case that vaccine producers are universally of the opinion that there's no use to this research.
Thank you very much. Please.
Boucher, Erasmus Medical Center. I would like to come back to a question raised by Dr. Haas in the previous session, asking whether the qualitative risk assessment should be done on just any BSL-3 or specific ones that actually perform this research. And I think that's a no-brainer. If we look at the presentation of Rebecca Morich, I think it's absolutely clear that the numbers that come out of the Henkel et al. Report that were reported here by Dr. Wyant do not directly translate in the risks as we would see them in the laboratories of Kaoka and mine. And to come back to the comment of Dr. Lipsitch, that there were no quantitative risk assessments in the previous assessments of risk, that may be true. Our governments so far have not demanded absolute quantitative risk assessment. They have worked on expert judgment and past performance. But it's important to note that all of these governments, and mine have been going through 5 independent reviews by 5 different organizations, all coming to the conclusion that my laboratory, when we do this work with negligible risk. Now, when we have negligible risk, the benefits of research easily outweigh those risks, because otherwise the risk wouldn't be negligible. Now, Dr. Lipsitch points out that there were no numbers, but I prefer no numbers rather than ridiculous numbers that make no sense. And I have taken the numbers of Dr. Lipsitch to go through the procedures in my laboratory to find out that if I use those numbers, I would have a laboratory-acquired infections once every 25,000 years. And then we have measures to prevent onward transmission. And if I put in those measures, which are all very easily quantifiable measures, I come to a likelihood of onward transmission once every 25 billion years. That's 5 times the age of the Earth. And so that is why risk assessors so far have come to the conclusion that we have negligible risks. And then we can multiply this number by the size of a pandemic, essentially by 1 billion. This is the question that Imperiali asked. You know, how does the numbers of Lipsitch, how can you rhyme that with the numbers of Wyant? Well, this is just by multiplying a negligible risk with a billion. This makes no sense. And so I really push towards having a quantitative risk assessment on the laboratories that do this work. Otherwise, there is no use of doing this quantitative risk assessment. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mark Dennison, Vanderbilt University. I wanted to just come back to something that I've been watching. I feel like the discussion has stayed around 40,000 feet in this process, and so that we really need to make sure we're defining terms very clearly. You know, what the denominators are, what the things that we're applying it to, what the current technology is as opposed to old technology, what strategies are already in place. For the most part, with a few exceptions, and certainly is true with the coronavirus laboratories, the labs performing this are small, and I mean less than 20 to 25 people, and some even smaller than that. So we're already working with a significant regulatory obligations with our own requirements and with specific requirements like DIRC, biosafety levels, biosafety level 3, careful reviews by our IBCs, as well as select agent representation. And so quantitatively, I haven't seen any sense of how many of the things that are being discussed here would be already captured through that process. I think that's one critical point that we need to very much incorporate going forward. The other concept I want to talk about is this issue of what's going to happen to our alternative models. So we've talked about alternative science approach, but we haven't talked about alternatives to a regulatory model that's downward. Okay, so if I already think about in an era of vanishing, I'm at a medical institution in the United States, which is struggling like many are with healthcare requirements and no additional funds. The NIH funding levels are declining, the competition is increasing, the regulatory burdens are significant, and there are no resources within current fundamental grants to support those processes at all. I won't go, if someone wants numbers in terms of details of days and hours that it takes to respond to that stuff in a year, they're profound and significant, and they come with penalties if they're not done. So they're not obligatory, they're not potential ones, they're real ones. So what I'm saying is I think we need to think about alternatives to that kind of regulation. If we could agree that pandemic pathogens or potential pandemic pathogens are in themselves significant and profoundly important and are going to continue to occur, then I think we need to think of models about resourcing within the laboratories by supplements or by other approaches to say we believe this research is critical at a national and international level and are going to support an approach to develop best practices within and across institutions that perform this research to allow them to unitize what they already have to do from a regulatory basis, to develop best practices, to share those, and to integrate with these important new concepts that I've been hearing here today from the social sciences and from risk analysis to devise processes that in fact deal with things as they really exist. And finally, that those things facilitate and encourage the development of scientists who are transdisciplinary in their understanding of pathogens, pathogenesis, social sciences, risk analysis, and biosafety, to encourage excellent research and to encourage a body of scientists who are able to lead in these areas in the future going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please.
I'm Rob Wyant from CDC. In listening to the discussions the last couple of days, I think that there's been a lot of very good work done in terms of honing what we mean when we talk about gain-of-function experiments, whether or not that's the most precise way of describing this work. And as the thought process continues, I would hope that some consideration is given once we have a better, more firm idea of the work that we are most concerned about. At this point in time, you know, as the regulator, I see this work in very few labs. The labs are well run, well overseen in responsible institutions. But I think we also need to consider that right now our N is a very small number. If that N grows by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude, what will be needed in order to assure that work at that level will be appropriately overseen?
Thank you.
Gary Epstein again. Actually, I'd like to build exactly on what Rob said in terms of once we decide what this is that we're most concerned about. A lot of issues we talked about are very difficult analyses, potentially intractable, but in terms of informing the next steps, something that would be tremendously important and I hope doable is to get technically precise about what the area we are most concerned about is. And part of the reason I think we may be looking like we're not in consensus is when we say this research, some people think developing an animal model for SARS, and some people think developing a highly mammalian transmissible version of highly pathogenic H5N1. And building on the triage discussions of Dr. Charo and Dr. Atlas earlier, if we can actually crystallize those experiments that are of most concern, gain of function clearly not the right word. We've also seen the term potential pandemic pathogen. If one wanted to be provocative, one could say we're looking at that set of experiments which potentially put the planet at risk. If we can crystallize what's at the very point, very top, and focus our discussions on those highest consequence experiments, I think we may find out that we are in more agreement than we might have thought. In terms of red light, green light, yellow light, you have to know whether there's an intersection. And that's on the lower end. At the upper end, we may be able to say, here's the terminology that accurately describes those things we are most concerned about. And that, I think, would be a tremendous service as we move ahead.
Thank you.
Mike Imperiali, Michigan. I'd like to comment about what our expectations are out of a risk-benefit analysis. So, and maybe a little bit of a word of caution. I mean, we've already heard that there's a lot of debate about how one quantifies the risks, and so there are different ways to look at it. People can come up with different numbers depending on what you feed into that equation. And that's the closest I think we can even get to any kind of quantification, because when we talk about the benefits, as we've heard, sometimes those are intangible or hard to predict. You know, there's preparedness, there's vaccines, there's the knowledge that we're gaining. Things may not be evident until 20 years into the future. And so I think that we need to not kid ourselves into thinking that we're going to be able to come up with some formula where we can plug in all these variables and come up with something where the risks outweigh the benefits or the benefits outweigh the risks. And so I think we need to acknowledge that it's going to be hard to quantify this equation. And on top of that, that even if we were able to come up with exact numbers, different individuals are going to put different values on the different variables. So some people may think the advancement of knowledge is much more important than whether or not, you know, this is going to inform, you know, vaccine preparedness. I'm just spitting out, you know, comparisons. Those may not be valid. So my feeling is that really one of the best things that can come out of the risk-benefit analysis are the discussions themselves, such that we can convince ourselves and the public that we have discussed these in depth, such that whatever decision we come to hasn't just sort of been pulled out of thin air, and that it really has been a careful, deliberative process.
Thank you. Please.
Christoph Fraser, Imperial College London. So I think just as in science, we tried to validate our models by the models we use for predicting the future based on their ability to predict the past. That might be a useful way to think of policy as well. I've heard a lot of arguments defending science done over the last 10, 15 years that was clearly useful and was never controversial in the first place. And we've also heard sort of a widely shared concern about the very small number of experiments which have taken place, which developed pathogens that were highly transmissible, highly pathogenic, and where empirical evidence based on current ongoing epidemics suggests would be very difficult to control despite containment measures. So any policy developed, we would want to make sure that we absolutely don't increase the burden of proof and regulation for all of the work which clearly has been incredibly useful in developing vaccines, in moving towards having good animal models for SARS and MERS, and really does allow us just to single out experiments which in the past have been controversial and which wouldn't have hindered all the other work which never was controversial in the first place.
Thank you very much. Please.
Hi, I'm Kavita Berger from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I actually wanted to make a comment about the types of risks that we've been talking about. So what I've observed in the last day and a half is that the types of risks that we've discussed have been very ill-defined. So we've talked about GMOs and biosafety from a Cartagena Protocol perspective. We've talked about biosafety and biosecurity from a laboratory security or infrastructure and personnel aspect. We've talked about very little about bioterrorism and almost nothing about potential misuse or the issue that someone might use information that's publicly available. And so as we go forward and think about how we conduct risk assessments, how we think about the policy implications, how we think about asking scientists and members of the scientific community to assess the risks, weigh the risks and benefits, we really need to be clear about what risks we're talking about, that we don't just mash all of these together as one big risk. We do, you know, albeit it's not perfect, but we do actually have guidance, regulations, infrastructure in place to deal with biosecurity and biosafety, and from a laboratory perspective, we are increasing in pockets efforts to have scientists think about the broader implications of their work. And oftentimes what I've seen is that a lot of the focus goes on the scientist that is actually following the rules, as opposed to the individual who will not follow the rules. And that's what, if I understand this debate correctly, that is what we're really concerned about. That's should be the core of this gain of function issue. It's someone might use it to cause harm. How do we include that in that overall risk assessment and think about it in that way? And the other comment I would make is that since this whole thing about dual use sort of came about over the last 10 years, I would not underestimate institutions in the US, certain institutions in Europe, and a growing number of institutions in other parts of the world through the work of, Canada, the US, EU, and others in being able to oversee and review research. It's not perfect, best practices can be shared, but there are increasing efforts and there are examples and models that can be highlighted as things to start with. And so that's